This isn't diplomacy, it's pressure, delivered with a smile. In less than 2 days, Canada was threatened with tariffs, military intimidation, and something far more dangerous: fragmentation. Here's the contradiction that matters. The United States talks about alliance, but behaves like leverage is the only language left. And this isn't abstract. This affects you because it shows how quickly powerful countries can test boundaries without ever declaring a conflict. On camera, Donald Trump laughed about trade with China and said Canada could lose ice hockey. It sounded ridiculous, almost theatrical. But notice what happened around that comment. 100% tariffs were floated. Fighter jets were mentioned. Defense agreements were suddenly conditional. And behind the scenes, U.S. officials were discussing separatist movements inside Canada itself. Jokes on the surface, pressure underneath. Canada didn't splinter. It unified. That response is the tell. Because when threats come wrapped as humor and policy at the same time, it's not chaos, it's a strategy. And once you see that, the story doesn't calm down. It accelerates. What actually triggered this wasn't a single remark. It was a chain reaction. Over the past 48 hours, Donald Trump publicly warned that if Canada deepens trade with China, tariffs would jump to 100%. Then came another threat, a 50% tariff on Canadian aircraft, specifically bombardier jets. On social media, Trump wrote that Canada had wrongfully, illegally, and steadfastly refused to certify U.S.-made aircraft and warned, if this situation is not immediately corrected, I'm going to charge Canada a 50% tariff. But here's the part that reframes everything. At the same time as those trade threats, U.S. officials were signaling pressure through defense, hinting that NORAD cooperation and F-35 access could be conditional. And simultaneously, U.S. figures were openly discussing Alberta as a natural partner and floating talk of a possible secession referendum. 3 pressure points: trade, defense, internal cohesion. That's not random overlap. That's a pattern forming in real time. So the real question isn't what Canada did wrong. It's why all of this arrived together, all at once, and what that combination is designed to force next. This is where the situation intensifies because the behavior stops looking unusual and starts looking familiar. Powerful states don't always apply pressure with troops or formal sanctions first. They normalize coercion step by step. First, it's trade, then it's security, then it's internal politics. We've seen this pattern before, not as history lessons, but as lived tactics. Economic threats framed as fairness. Military cooperation turned conditional, and domestic divisions quietly encouraged from the outside. In this case, the defense angle mattered most. The Trump administration signaled that if Canada didn't buy American F-35s, NORAD cooperation could be at risk. And that's not abstract. Canada relies on shared air defense. At the same time, U.S. officials suggested they could fly F-35s over Canada whenever they want. On its own, that sounds like bluster. But paired with trade punishment and separatist talk, it becomes something else. This is the normalization of pressure that shouldn't be normal, because alliances aren't supposed to come with intimidation clauses. And when joking comments about ice hockey coexist with threats about jets and sovereignty, the line between humor and force disappears. That's the escalation, and it's exactly why Canada's response mattered so much. Now let's talk about the proof of something even more troubling: the contradiction between words and actions. The Trump administration publicly disavowed any intention to actively break up Canada. But what it did instead was far more insidious. It quietly opened the door for destabilization by nurturing secessionist sentiments. The U.S. ambassador to Canada was reported to have had secret conversations with extremist separatist groups in Alberta, encouraging them to seek independence from the rest of Canada. These groups, with figures like Danielle Smith, Alberta's premier, actively stoking the fire, were pushed into the spotlight. The narrative was seeded, not directly, but with undeniable implication. Alberta should separate, and the U.S. would be there to support it. This isn't just talk. It's the exact same playbook used by external powers in other parts of the world, including Russia and Ukraine. It's destabilization by proxy. And that's where the contradiction lands. If you claim to support Canada, why actively destabilize it from within? Why play both sides? This isn't about policy differences anymore. It's a calculated move to create the kind of uncertainty where a country starts to crumble from the inside. And once that starts, there's no going back. Here's where it gets even more intense. The clock is ticking. In response to this mounting pressure, Canadian leaders didn't flinch. In fact, they did exactly what you'd expect from a united front under attack. Prime Minister Carney made it crystal clear Canada's sovereignty wasn't for sale. He didn't waste time engaging in every public statement or every crazy remark coming from Washington. Instead, he made one thing clear to Donald Trump: don't you dare threaten Canadian sovereignty. That wasn't just political talk, that was a clear, visible red line. Meanwhile, other leaders across Canada backed him up. David Eby, the Premier of British Columbia, didn't mince words either. He said, if you're coming into our country and trying to force our provinces to secede, you are treasonous. That's the kind of statement you can't ignore. But here's where things flip. Not everyone in Canada felt the same way. Alberta's Premier, Danielle Smith, didn't respond directly. Instead, she framed it as a discussion about Alberta's democratic process. That's not just dodging the issue. That's complicating the fight, because when one province quietly entertains the idea of secession, it raises an uncomfortable question: is Canada truly united in the face of this kind of pressure? And if not, who stands to benefit when the country splits? This is where things get even murkier. It's not just about the domestic political fallout. The real problem is what happens when uncertainty is weaponized. Take Premier Ford of Ontario's response. He condemned the talk of secession, called it unacceptable, and said we should all be sticking together. But then he raised a key issue. Why is this conversation even happening? Why is Alberta's secession being discussed at all, quietly supported by Washington, while Canada faces an external threat? Ford's point is crucial. He's calling out the idea that Canada, in the midst of all this pressure, might fracture. He understands that if Canada doesn't stand together, it plays into Trump's hands. The cracks are there, even if no one wants to admit it. When Ford says, united we stand, divided we fall, he's pointing to something deeper, a national identity under siege. But here's what's terrifying. If the United States continues to subtly push Alberta towards secession, how long before other provinces start questioning their loyalty? How long before this story shifts from diplomatic posturing to an actual civil fracture? The next move is already forming. And if it continues, Canada may find itself not just under attack, but in the midst of a war for its very unity. Now let's bring this back to the real-world consequences. When something like this plays out on the global stage, it's easy to feel detached. But the reality is this: ordinary people are the ones who'll feel the ripple effects. This isn't just a matter of trade deals or international politics anymore. This is about what happens when a country's integrity is put to the test. For Canadians, it's not just about having to pay higher tariffs. It's about how these economic pressures, these defense threats, and the discussions around secession affect their day-to-day lives. Imagine if you woke up tomorrow and your entire country was suddenly facing a potential breakup. Would you feel secure? Would your future feel certain? For Canadians living in Alberta, where these separatist movements are being encouraged, it means something even more personal. They have to ask themselves whether their province is truly part of the country they've known. And for everyone, from British Columbia to Ontario, it's the same question. Is this a fight worth winning? This isn't just political drama. It's a struggle over the fundamental unity that holds a country together. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments, because this isn't about a hypothetical future. It's happening now. Let's zoom out for a second and look at the system that makes all of this possible. It's not just the threats from one government to another. It's the underlying mechanics of power that allow this kind of manipulation to happen in the first place. The U.S. didn't just try to use its leverage over Canada for trade. It exploited systemic weaknesses. Canada's reliance on the U.S. for military equipment and defense agreements made it vulnerable to coercion. The fact that Canada's F-35s come with strings attached, that they depend on U.S. maintenance and support, left Canada open to pressure. This is where the real danger lies. When countries become dependent on each other for military or economic power, that's when the leverage shifts from mutual cooperation to exploitation. The U.S. isn't just playing a trade game, it's playing a long-term strategy. Every threat, every tactic is designed to exploit Canada's weaknesses, both internal and external. The question is, why is this kind of pressure still effective? Why does Canada still depend so much on U.S. cooperation, even when that cooperation comes at a price? Because when countries like Canada become too reliant, they risk losing their autonomy in the process. This isn't just about trade deals or military jets. It's about the system of leverage that allows one country to dictate the terms of its neighbor's survival. The future of this situation isn't clear, but the direction is already forming. There are two possible paths ahead, and both are fraught with risk. The first path is the path of resistance. Canada stands firm against the mounting pressure. It strengthens its internal unity and proves to the world that its sovereignty isn't up for debate. The prime ministers rally around their country, publicly defying Washington, showing that they won't be intimidated into compliance. In this scenario, Canada might lose some economic ground. Trade deals might become harder to negotiate, and tariffs might rise. But in the end, the country retains its independence. The second path, though, is far more dangerous. Canada might begin to fracture, with certain provinces like